Alright, here's a video of everything from the beginning of Unit 4 onward, so that if you were absent for any of the lessons, you'll be able to catch up. I know that we don't have a packet for this, so you won't know exactly what slides to look for, so I'd suggest if you were absent, flipping through this video a little bit to try to find anything that you just haven't seen, basically. We started with some review, basically pointing out that once again, Joshua and Judges, those books that we covered before Thanksgiving, cover a time period in which the people are capturing the land and settling there. They believe very strongly that their success depends on faith, that it's not about the size of your military or the preparedness of the military or your strong leadership. It's about your faithful leadership. We spoke briefly about how faithful leadership will cause society somewhat automatically to be more united, because all of the peasants in society, the folks who don't really understand politics anyway, would have been looking for someone who was faithful to sort of guide them. You still see this in cultures that sort of, I don't know if we want to say that they're pre-modern, but pre-industrial cultures today, where in the absence of a clear set of leaders, people turn towards the most religious leaders that they can find. Basically, this is because religious traditions run so deeply in society that it's kind of the default when there's no other obvious way forward. The remainder of the Deuteronomistic histories, these books we were talking about before break, that tell Israelite history in such a way as to make the point that success comes from faithfulness, is going to cover the period of the Israelite kingdoms, which are established around 1000 BCE and continue up to the year 587, which is, of course, the year when the Babylonians showed up and captured the place, putting an end, obviously, to the Israelite and Judahite kingdoms. Here's a timeline. As I've said before, most of these events should not be understood as literal or historical events, but people have asked me several times, to situate the events we're talking about, to get a sense of how what we're about to talk about relates with everything else we've covered thus far this year. I start with 3 italicized things here. These are the events that we really only have the Bible's record about. In other words, Exodus, there's no Egyptian record of Exodus whatsoever. There's no archaeological record of Exodus whatsoever. We kind of, if we believe it occurred, would have to rely entirely on the Bible to make the case that it did in fact occur. Would have happened around 1300 BCE according to the Bible's own dating system, Bible's own chronology, in other words. Again, that's if it happened at all. More importantly, please always remember that we're not looking for the historical reality of these events so much as the paradigmatic points, in other words, the responses that they give to the big questions. Joshua and Judges, the books that we sort of briefly looked at before Thanksgiving, would have been between about 1260 and about 1000 BCE. Transition into monarchy, remember we said that eventually the sort of loose confederation of farmers that existed in Joshua and Judges would become very much unwieldy and sort of naturally transition into a monarchy. That seems to have happened in around the very early 10th century. Now I've unitalicized these things and we're typing them regularly. The reign of David would have been between about 1000 and 970. We know with greater certainty that David actually existed. We didn't actually until about the 1970s when we found a piece of rock, a piece of pottery rather, called the Tel Dan Stela. Don't worry too much about that. Basically, it was an ancient piece of pottery that had the name David written on the side of it. House of David, it said specifically. That means that that would mean nothing in our society now to find a piece of paper with someone's name written on it. But in an ancient society where no one could really read or write, the idea that somebody's name would appear actually does indicate a lot about that person. It shows that they were of great importance. Whether David, as described in the Bible, actually existed, likely not. Whether a David existed and had great power in this area at the right time period, that seems to be more certain. His son Solomon ruled after him for about 40 years. The reign of Solomon saw a golden age, the construction of the temple, and then a very long, slow decline. Solomon, by the end of his reign, kind of loses his mind and starts doing all kinds of things he shouldn't do, including worshiping other gods and all of that other stuff. Um, After Solomon, you have a handful of good kings here and there, but by and large, most of the kings are going to be completely awful. The kingdom is going to split into two shortly after Solomon dies, and the exile is ultimately the result. All this stuff is going to start getting written down. All the stuff that we've studied so far gets written down or edited at least into its final form. The text may have existed earlier during the Babylonian exile. So if you look at this carefully, what this says is that it's at least 750 years between when the Exodus would have actually occurred and when the stuff starts to get written down about the Exodus. That's kind of why I like to make this point that we're not worried about the actual historical reality of these things so much as the points they make. Think for a second if the first time anyone ever wrote anything down about the year 1268 were right now, right? That's 750 years ago from now. I'd be very impressed to find anybody could name something off the top of their head that had happened in the year 1268. I've got some possible ideas, but nothing certain. All right. The situation we find ourselves in with the kingdom is that the Israelites, as they sort of establish themselves, are surrounded by a lot of groups of people that don't like them very much. Part of that problem is that monotheism that they practice angers their neighbors. Why would this be the case? Well, in the ancient world, everybody was a polytheist, or at least this part of the ancient world. I want to be clear, of course, but in the Middle East anyway, everybody was polytheists. What that meant was that the way to establish sort of foreign relations was just to sort of mix your two religions together. If I've got 10 religions, or 10 gods rather, in my religion, and you've got 10 gods in yours, the way that we would establish a good connection was simply to swap gods. We would all have 20 now, and it would be fine. The Israelites obviously can't do this. So when they need to make trade pacts or make just general foreign relations deals, they can't do what you would normally do and simply find a common god and swear by that god's name. So with time, their uniqueness is going to make relations with these other nations very difficult, and they end up surrounded by tons and tons of enemies. The most important of these are going to be the Philistines. The trouble here is there are lots and lots of them. Basically, any group of people that you see mentioned that isn't Israelites is among the enemies. As they get a little bit of success in establishing themselves and in dealing with their enemies, they start to desire more success. Specialness becomes more awkward, and they want to be more like the other nations. Unfortunately, being like the other nations around them, which would be a very practical and intelligent thing to do, often requires them to break with their religious tradition. And that's a problem for a lot of reasons. Once again, most of the people in society are peasant farmers. They don't understand politics. So if, for political reasons, you start breaking with the religious tradition, the peasants are going to get a little bit upset. For obvious reasons, right? They only understand that, and they may cease to follow you quite as faithfully. Basically, what this means is that every time, and we've discussed this before too, that every time they start to break the law for practical reasons, society does become kind of frayed at the edges and divided against itself. Specifically, I'm going to go ahead and skip this next slide real quick and then come back to it. There's a guy named Samuel, a priest and a prophet, a miracle child, as we've seen so many people in the Bible were. He is sort of this religious leader that everybody follows. What they end up demanding is that he permit them to become more like the other nations so that their diplomacy can be a little bit easier. He says not to, and I of course jokingly put not that Samuel. I'm sorry these slides are out of order. But he says not to do so because that does two things. First of all, it leads the people away from God. And second of all, it gives other nations control over the Israelites' identity. Imagine for a second that some president said we're going to become more like France and everything's going to be great. Well, that would give France control to a certain extent over the development of American culture. That would bother people now, obviously, and it bothered people back then. Their main demand is going to be to have the same kind of government that their neighbors have. They want a king, probably to ease diplomacy and trade. If you need to negotiate a peace treaty or a trade deal, you need to be able to go in and do it with the one leader. This is why we don't have 5 presidents of the United States. Imagine if they disagreed with each other, it would be a big disaster, right? People demand a king. Samuel and God are going to resist, but ultimately, they're not going to get their way. Sorry, Samuel and God are not going to get their way. The people are going to get their way, and they're going to appoint a man named Saul king over them. Once they do that, of course, they end up sort of stuck with the king. Saul's not going to turn out to be a particularly faithful guy. If you read 1 Samuel 8, you'll see the story described where the people ask for a king. Samuel prays about it, tells them all the reasons they don't want a king, and they say, of course we want one, and he gives them a king anyway. Real quick. These were some class activities where we discussed the distinction between the moral and the practical path forward, using the boat scene from The Dark Knight Rises, the Batman movie. We discussed basically whether you should blow up another boat full of people in order to save your own hide. I think most people probably would do so, but there was a debate that we had. And the idea was that we wanted to demonstrate that as humans, we are often faced with a choice of whether to do what's right or what's sort of easy and convenient. The following stories that we're going to take a look at, the stories of King Saul, the first king, and King David, are going to try to demonstrate that actually choosing what's easy over what's right may seem great in the short term, but it doesn't work out in the long run. Because they wanted a king for practical reasons, it should be no surprise that they choose a very popular king. They choose a man named Saul, who everybody likes. He's a very practical guy with a good military resume, and he's a very charismatic guy, which means he's sort of very likable. Early on, he's going to be tremendously successful, mostly because early on, the divine laws and the practical way forward line up perfectly. He's going to follow the law as long as his sort of practical instincts say that it's a good idea to do so. The problem is, of course, that that doesn't usually last for very long. The reality, of course, of human life is that most moral decisions we make are not that difficult, right? My decision not to just walk up and punch somebody, that's a moral decision and a practical decision. Nobody would benefit if I did it. But, of course, you don't bring on a king so he can manage in situations where the way forward is obvious. You bring on a king to deal with crises, and crises end up arising when practicality and morality become different. I'll explain in a moment why there's a cow on this slide. Once the law gets impractical, Saul breaks it. In the book, you'll see that Samuel is going to sort of continuously give Saul instructions from God, and Saul is going to continually break those instructions. Among these instructions are that he's not allowed to take prisoners when he captures a city. He has to kill everybody. And he's also not allowed to capture their livestock. He has to kill it and burn it, just to get rid of it, basically. The reason for this is because the Israelites viewed themselves as so culturally superior to the people around them that the idea of taking prisoners or even taking livestock would threaten that Israelite culture would become diluted, that it would become less pure. That's super racist by today's standards. We try to understand that, in the era that this came from, that's kind of how everybody thought of their own group. The reason there's a happy cow here is because Saul didn't murder the cows when he captured a city. That's a bad joke. And when I taught this in class, it took me like a minute and a half to figure out what the picture of a cow was for. It's not the Chick-fil-A cow, it's the happy cows come from California cow, but whatever. Saul chooses practical paths every single time he has to make the decision. Among those practical paths, he's going to make his own sacrifices, which is a priest's job. That's not a big deal by modern standards, certainly, but basically, the reason you didn't want to do it was because when you sacrificed an animal, you also butchered it and ate most of it. I don't know if any of you have ever butchered an animal, but if you don't know what you're doing, it's a big bloody mess. And so there was a rule back then that you allowed a priest to do it to avoid having amateurs do it. He lets captured animals live so that later on when he needs to feed his army, he'll be able to. People ask me about this. It's like, why let them live just to kill them? The reason is because there was no refrigeration back in the day. The way to keep meat fresh was to leave the animal alive until it was time to eat it. Ultimately, what's going to happen is that Saul is going to make all of these practical decisions, each one of which we could easily forgive and say, I totally understand why he did that. But ultimately, uh, it's not about the single actions, it's about the general attitude of being totally unfaithful. God's going to get mad at him and he's going to reject his kingship. He's going to leave him on the throne, but he's going to stop backing him up. And what he's going to do is send Samuel to a place called Bethlehem, to the house of a guy named Jesse. And Samuel is going to secretly make Jesse's youngest son, David, king. Basically, going to give him an instruction to say, God doesn't want anybody to know you're a king yet. And for years, David doesn't tell anybody. This is about the least practical thing a king could possibly do, if you think about it, right? The idea that you would, sorry, I forgot where I was there for a second. The idea that you would not tell people that you're the king is not a practical thing, but David does it because he's a faithful person. And ultimately, with time, David will end up taking over Saul's kingship. So in short, Saul is great at first, but it backfires. People are happy that he's so practical, they understand what motivates him, but that's not what this is about. It's all about faith. God's going to turn away Saul, but only because Saul turned away God. David's going to replace Saul, and it's quickly going to become clear, despite the fact that he keeps his kingship secret, that he is in fact the one with God's backing. Because with time, he's going to start doing more and more really cool stuff that gets him noticed. Those are some video clips that I skipped over. There's a very bad movie from 1996. Actually, I think it was a TV miniseries called King David. And Mr. Spock from Star Trek plays the Prophet Samuel. It's just like the worst thing ever made. I love bad movies, so I show that clip in class. Can't do it on here or I'll end up with a copyright strike. I'd prefer to avoid that. David shows us that faith is practical after all. That in the long run, choosing what seems not to work in the short term, in other words, choosing what is right over what is easy, actually turns out to be the easier thing to do, if that makes sense. Because in the long run, doing the right thing is what works out best. That's the point of David's story. David is mostly faithful. David is not perfect, and we have to be clear about that. But when David screws up, he's sorry, and he tries not to do it again. Saul, on the other hand, was totally unrepentant. He just sort of rolled with it. Ultimately, for his faith, David gets a reward, which is that God establishes his dynasty forever. Says to him, look, your family is going to be on the throne until the end of time. This is called the Davidic covenant. And basically, it's God updating the covenant to match the new situation that people find themselves in. We have to be careful about this. It's interesting that they would write down this promise by God. And it's interesting because they write this down during the Babylonian exile. Right? So what that means is they're writing a story where God promises to leave David's family on the throne forever. But they're doing it at a time when that dynasty has already been dethroned. What ends up arising is this sort of mysticism that says, like, in some respect or another, there is still a king. That becomes what's called messianism, the search for a Messiah. And that ultimately is kind of what Christians pick up on by declaring Jesus the son of David, a person from Bethlehem, just like David, and that's ultimately where we're going. But that is something that's kind of quietly part of Judaism, is this hope for a future arrival of a Davidic king. It's not a significant focus of Judaism anymore, but it has been in the past, and we'll talk more about that as we get forward into the New Testament. David's son, his youngest son, Solomon, succeeds him. Solomon gets to build the temple, which is sort of the crowning achievement of the entire history. This is the Golden Age. Problem is, later on in his life, Solomon goes crazy and ends up becoming unfaithful. Ultimately, the kingdom is going to divide into two, and the rest of the kings, with very few exceptions, are pretty awful. And ultimately, the king's unfaithfulness, which would actually, on a real level, real historical level, have caused society to become somewhat frayed. The king's unfaithfulness is what brings about, according to their own understanding, the Babylonian exile. We can't blame God. We can't say the Babylonians were stronger, because that would say that God was weak. But what we can do is say that the Babylonian exile was our own fault, and that's what they go for. This is pretty funny. I found this online as a sad child. Anyway, the next thing we looked at was the eras of prophecy. Now that you know the history of what goes on pretty well, right? You have the rise of the kings, you have the slow decline of the kingdom, and you have the exile. We can start talking about the different groups of people, the different prophets who came in and tried to lead people to do what was right in these circumstances. If you've ever had to tell your parents how your day went, and then tell your grandparents, and then tell your brother, then tell your neighbor, then your best friend, then your teacher, you'll notice that you don't tell the same story every time. That's an important point. Audiences matter tremendously. You might have the same point, you are describing the same day, after all, but the way you describe it to Grandma and the way you might describe it to me are going to be quite different. Likewise, prophets are going to be quite different based on what time period they're speaking in. We have pre-exilic prophecy. These guys write before the fall of the kingdoms. The northern kingdom falls in 722, the southern in 587. And they're writing in a circumstance where things are okay, but they're about to get much worse. Basically, these guys say, repent, the end is near. If we don't turn it around right now, we're going to get captured. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Exilic prophets are going to write during the Babylonian exile. And they're going to say, yes, things are bad. Yes, it's our fault, but we can make it better. Post-exilic prophets we'll deal with after Christmas. Don't worry about these for right now. These are written after the exile. The exile ends in 538 BC, and it ends somewhat unexpectedly, because what happens is the Persian Empire rises up and captures the Babylonians. People foresaw that, but not very far in advance. And so post-exilic prophecy is probably better connected to our stuff after Christmas, sort of close. How do we say? It's probably more closely related to the New Testament than it is to much of the Old, if that makes sense. We'll make sense of it later. Point here is pre-exilic and exilic prophecy are all we're looking at for right now. All types of prophecy have the same message. Be faithful. Do what you know is right. That same message we've been hearing in the Bible the entire time. The thing is, their delivery is radically different. Pre-exilic prophets warn people, get back on track or society's going to fall apart. Often pre-exilic prophets say that the kings are worshiping other gods, and that's bad, or they're mistreating the poor. That's also bad, first of all, because it's against the religious rules, right? You have to be nice to poor people if you're a religious person. That's just part of the deal. But also because a society that treats its poor badly enough is not a strong society. If you set it up so that the people in the bottom have no power whatsoever and struggle just to feed themselves, that does not give you a strong society. And so on a very real practical level, the prophets are right in pointing out that if the people are bad to the poor, things won't work out. Amos is probably the most aggressive of the pre-exilic prophets, so to speak. He's just talking about like God's ready to punish people. He's listing off people's sins. It's not good. Pre-exilic prophets, though, in predicting that if people don't turn things around, in warning people that if they don't turn things around, then they're going to get captured, they're not predicting the future. They're observing the obvious, if that makes sense. It's kind of like in the bottom of the ninth inning, if you're down by 20 runs, you're not going to win that game. Saying that is not predicting the future, it's just kind of observing the obvious. The Israelites are surrounded by several giant empires. If the Israelites become divided against one another, which mistreating the poor will definitely cause them to do, one of those empires is going to snatch them up. I just want to be clear about that really quickly. A lot of people think that prophets can predict the future. They can't. Sometimes the stuff they say seems to point forward to the New Testament, and we could say that, of course, maybe God sort of wanted it that way. Probably a more responsible explanation for exactly why the New Testament seems to so perfectly match up with the Old is because the guys who wrote, and they were all guys pretty much, the guys who wrote the New Testament knew the Old Testament really well. They connected stuff on purpose. The early Christians believed that Jesus was, and so do modern Christians, believed that Jesus was the fulfillment of all of these prophecies. So when they're writing the story, they're going to tell the story in such a way that it makes it clear exactly why he's the fulfillment of all the prophecies. They're not being cynical and sort of deliberately connecting things to the Old Testament. What they're doing is trying to make a larger case. But anyway, as you read some of these prophets, you're going to go, oh, that looks like it's talking about Jesus. It's not. Exilic prophecies comfort people. They don't say, do whatever you want, to be clear. So a pre-exilic prophet might say something like, if you keep if you keep skipping practice, you're going to get kicked off the team. That might be something that they'd say. If you keep doing this bad stuff, bad things are going to happen. Exilic prophets don't say, oh, you don't have to go to practice. What they do is they step into a situation that's already bad. Perhaps you've already been kicked off the team. And they say, look, it's going to be okay. We did some bad stuff. It's all in the past. It's okay now, and we can pick up and move forward. These guys write during the Babylonian exile, 587 to 538. To reuse my example again of getting kicked off a team, they might say, well, you did get kicked off a team and it was because you didn't go to practice, so it's kind of your fault, but that's not the big deal because there's 10 other teams you can go play for, and maybe you'll throw yourself into the chess club, and maybe you'll just, maybe you'll find some other way forward. That's what exilic prophets tell people to do. Have hope when things look hopeless. And Isaiah 40 is probably the classic, the quintessential, so to speak, exilic prophecy. You'll want to look both at this Amos example and at this Isaiah example, just to get a sense for what's going on. We ended the sort of lesson portion of this class by taking a look at this. If you read through this, you can guess what time period it comes from. This is all about warning, so it must be pre-exilic. Okay? In On Campus, you'll find two assignments, one called Stretch Day Part 1, the other called Stretch Day Part 2. Stretch Day Part 1 is going to just give you a bunch of extra passages and ask you to try to identify what time period they're from. Give that a shot if you were absent the day we did it, which is the stretch days, obviously, and if you have any questions, please come talk to me. Should be pretty straightforward. Stretch Day Part 2, we wrote our own prophecies. Basically, I had students do that so I could get a real sense of whether they understood what these prophets were all about. If you were out that day, you probably don't have to worry much about that assignment. The remainder of this unit, which is where we're going to be talking about specific prophets, is available in another video. I'll put the link to it in the description to this video. So if you are missing your notes on Isaiah, Jeremiah, or Ezekiel, which is what we're going to be looking at next, there is a video for that. Just make sure you catch that. There's also a packet for that next chunk. I do apologize again for not having a packet of any sort for this unit. As I said, I sort of cut this unit up and rearranged it, so the old packet would not have made very much sense. Next year there will be a good new packet, but that, of course, is not particularly helpful to you, and I am sorry. Thanks for taking a look at this. I will see you soon. Peace.